All right. Well, just in light of what we talked about kind of in the first session, recapturing the missionary nature of the church, incarnational presence, participation in God's mission, an obvious kind of next topic of discussion is just as a leader in the church, how do you begin to make some shifts to help people move in a direction where they engage God's mission more fully? So to do that, what I'd like to do is first just kind of give you a little bit of language around two different types of leadership. One that I think fit the church really well in the past, and then one that we just need to be framing what we mean by leadership a little bit differently, I think, today in a rapidly increasing missionary context. And then we're just going to talk about some really super practical things of how to do that. So to get started, let's see if the new batteries work. It looks like they are. So I think it's helpful, we're just going to touch on this barely, but I think it's helpful to make a distinction between what some people call operational leadership. Sometimes they'll call it tactical leadership. That's not my favorite way to refer to it. Sometimes they'll refer to it as organizational leadership. But there's a difference between operational leadership and adaptive leadership. Okay, I don't think it's going to work. So, there, now it is. Sounds like it's working there, Randy. Let's try it. If not, I'll grab a handheld. So, just a little distinction here between operational and adaptive, okay? So I'm going to, just one slide on each, a little definitions, and you'll very clearly see kind of where we're going with this. So first off, operational leadership. Here's how most people define it. It says an operational leader is best suited for organizations that are in a relatively stable environment where maintenance and development of current programming constitutes the core task of leadership. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, right? It's just operational leadership for those organizations that aren't experiencing much change. Things are pretty stable, kind of status quo, and that kind of organization needs a leader that can just kind of like follow the prompts, kind of keep the ball moving down the field sort of thing. It works and is appropriate, so there's nothing wrong with this, okay, if the type of leadership fits the type of organization. It works and is appropriate for organizations in situations of stability. Operational leadership works best when the problems faced can be dealt with by drawing on pre-existing range of solutions. So in other words, it's like, here's how it's always worked in the past, so to move forward, since everything's kind of the same, we can just do what we've done in the past again and again and again. It is usually a top-down form of leadership where a solution is devised from above and rolled out through the ranks, right? So that's kind of a typical way we a lot of times think of leadership, operational organizational leadership. Well, in light of what we talked about a few minutes ago, you probably imagine I don't think that fits anymore. As far as church leadership, because we're not in a place of stability. Things are changing rapidly. In some cases, things are very uncertain. Things are very unstable. So I think we just need to think about leadership a little bit differently. So the way most people refer to that is adaptive leadership. So there's a super easy, simple way to think about it. And then let's talk about, well, what sorts of things need to be involved if you're going to try to become more of an adaptive leader. And you might say, hey, I'm not an adaptive leader at all. That's okay, but you probably ought to have someone on your team that can help you think along those lines. So an adaptive leader is best suited in organizations that are experiencing times of significant transition, instability, and uncertainty. So have you felt like that in the last 2 years? I'm guessing many of you in this room have. I have. It says an adaptive leader recognizes the need for change. He or she helps both individuals and organizations adapt and thrive through new forms and expressions where agility, innovation, and creativity are needed. Okay? Pretty straightforward there, but you see the difference, right? I just think in the context that most of us find ourselves, we need to think like macro-wise, we need to think a little differently about leadership. It's not just operational, organizational leadership, but we need to be thinking more adaptively. So how do we do that? Well, I want to share with you at least, there's more than this, but 3 kind of practical ways to lean into what it means to be an adaptive leader. And let me tell you what the 3 things are, and then we're going to unpack each of these just a little bit. So I think first off, an adaptive leader has to be able to correctly assess reality. Part of that has to do with what we just talked about, that we need to be able to articulate the need for the church to become a missionary entity once again, because we live in a very different context. We can't operate like the way we did in the past, but we need to recapture the missionary nature or essence of the church. But secondly, in light of that, we need to cultivate a missionary culture. And I think there are some real practical things, 3 or 4 things that we can do to think about what forms culture and what forms church culture. That's the kind of culture I'm talking about here. And then lastly, how can we go about activating all the people of God? Not some, but how can we go about activating everyone? We're going to talk a little bit about that in this session, and then tomorrow we're going to talk real practically about that as well. So let's talk about each of these 3. There's a lot we could say on each of these, but on correctly assessing reality, I think if nothing else, we have to talk a little bit about the shift between what is called Christendom and post-Christendom. Once again, if you're familiar with that little free ebook, there's a little lesson or kind of mini chapter in there. But I just want to share this little visual is in the book. I think this is just I think this is a really helpful, simple way to visualize this shift that's taking place. So I just want to show you this little visual. Get a little closer. All right. And I just need to look forward. Sorry. I'd like to look over here and I'd like to look over here, but maybe I better not. All right. So here's the visual. If you haven't been introduced to that little ebook, you've never seen this before, but I think this is a helpful way to help people recognize there's been a shift in where the church finds itself in culture. So these 3 little circles, let me describe this. In the first circle, this is AD 30. So this is pre-Constantine, let's just call it early church, okay? In AD 30, the dominant seat of culture, or what I call it the prevailing influence of culture, it was the Roman Empire. So that little circle there in the middle of the first circle just says Rome. The point is, the Roman Empire called the shots. The Roman Empire, everything that was taking place in the Roman Empire kind of came down from high from Rome and the emperor. So it was the Roman Empire was the dominant seat of culture or the prevailing influence of culture. At this time, the church was this tiny little marginalized group that was really relegated to the margins. Now, in this little image, that looks like a plus sign. That should be a cross in that small little circle. So that's just representing the church, the early church, okay? So what I'm trying to depict here in that little image is even though the church was this tiny little marginalized sect, S-E-C-T, that was relegated to the margins, it was making major influences, or is having a major influence on the dominant seat of culture. We know from Scripture, we know from Paul's letters, we know from early church history that the church was making some major significant inroads into the dominant seat of culture, all right? So that was AD 30. But then something happened. If we could put a dotted line between the first circle and the second circle that went vertically, in 312 AD, those of you who know a little bit of church history, Constantine, who was the Roman emperor, had, and some historians debate this, but he said he had a conversion experience. And he ended religious persecution. So, up to this point, persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire kind of came in waves, depending on who the emperor was. Sometimes it was regional, sometimes it was like empire-wide, and it depended on who the emperor was. Well, right before Constantine became the emperor, there was an emperor by the name of Diocletian, and he was the worst of all. I mean, he wanted to eradicate Christianity. So Christianity, the persecution was super high, and it was empire-wide. Well, when Constantine became the Roman emperor, he had a so-called conversion experience, and he saw a cross, and he attributed it to Jesus. So he ended religious persecution in 312. There was this law that was passed. It was called the Edict of Milan, and it instantly ended religious persecution, which was a really good thing, right? The bad thing that happened is the next Roman emperor, whose name was Theodosius, he actually made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it changed everything. So here's the way I like to say it sometimes. And so this second circle is represented by this. It says, what was largely an illegal, underground, subversive Jesus people movement was now given enormous money, status, power, and legitimacy. It fundamentally changed our missiology and our ecclesiology. So here's the point in that middle circle. Even though the end of religious persecution was a very, very good thing, the bad thing was the power of the Roman Empire and the church was wedded together. And then this thing that was this crazy, chaotic, amazing movement became a monument. It became an institution. And when I say it fundamentally changed our missiology and our ecclesiology, briefly what I mean by that is, first off, it changed our missiology because everybody was a Christian. And if everyone was a Christian, you didn't have to have evangelism or mission anymore. And then it changed our ecclesiology because now the church was given enormous money, buildings. I mean, again, it went from being this movement to really being a monument or an institution. It changed everything. Does that make sense? So in the middle circle, what people call Christendom is just that wedding of the Roman power with the church together. So where the Roman Empire was the dominant seat of culture, in AD 13, really this kind of perverted version of Christianity wedded with the Roman Empire, that became the dominant seat of culture. All right? But then I would argue somewhere in the mid-21st century, what happened is what was called post-Christendom, and post just means after. So it means after Christendom. And Christendom just means that the wedding together of the Roman Empire and the church. So something happened and Christendom started to crumble, and we live here today. So the third circle, I would say, represents like our context today, but it's a little different. Now I would say there really isn't one single dominant seat of culture. There really isn't one single prevailing influence of culture. In fact, there's multiple ideologies. So all those little circles there in the middle kind of represent all those ideologies. Here's the thing I want you to get from all this. The church is once again relegated to the margins. So we're that little tiny circle out on the edge, just like we were in AD 30. Well, here's the thing. A lot of people in your churches, they want to see us go back to the middle circle. And I would say, so they see this as a bad thing. Post-Christendom is a bad thing. I would say, no, it's actually a good thing. Because instead of operating from a place of privilege and power, we once again have to operate from the posture of a servant. Another way to say that is we actually have to follow the ways of Jesus. And if we do, we can have major influence on the dominant seats of culture, just like the early church did. But we have to think differently. So see, I think part of being an adaptive leader is, for our congregations, we have to correctly assess reality. So we have to be able to explain to them and model for them in many ways that we just don't live in a context where we used to live. Things are radically different, and it's not a bad thing. If we actually follow the person, work, and ways of Jesus, it's actually a good thing. So I love this quote. I feel like a book pusher, but I love anything written by this guy too. His name's Michael Goheen. But man, this quote here kind of summarizes for me just the need of thinking differently about the church and Christian context and all of that. So here's what he writes. He says, the myth of a Christian culture continues to set the mind of the Western church at ease. This myth assumes that the West is or once was a Christian culture. If the culture is Christian, then there is no need to analyze its assumptions or develop a countercultural instinct. So in other words, if the culture is still Christian, then we're all good, right? It's like we don't really have to have these difficult conversations. We don't really have to unlearn and relearn. We just need to keep doing what we've always done, and everything's going to be okay. But remember, we said earlier, it doesn't matter what indicator you look at to judge church health or church growth in the United States. It's all moving in the wrong direction. So here's the way I like to say it. If we don't correctly assess reality, we'll be incapable of making the necessary changes in the way we think and act. So if we don't grapple with this Christendom to post-Christendom shift, we just won't be capable of making the necessary changes. Instead, we'll just want to tweak things. We'll just think everything's okay and all we have to do is tweak. So you'll see, just so I wouldn't forget, you might not be able to see because it's a really tiny font, but it says phone call story. I have to tell you something that happened a time when I was working, and this is just a story that just kind of illustrates all of it for me. A time when I was working with lots of church planters in Kansas City. So I didn't mention this earlier, but I grew up in Wichita, and then we lived in Kansas City for a very long time. I was what's called a church planter catalyst for 15 years in Kansas City. But 3 years ago, we moved to the Tampa Bay area of Florida. Part of it is I'm getting old and I don't like ice and snow anymore. I like the warm weather. But then also there's a church in Tampa called the Tampa Underground. So we probably won't have time to talk about this. So if you're interested at all, just Google Tampa Underground. They have a fantastic website that describes who they are. But it's the single best example of what I would call a decentralized network of microchurches. They've been at it for about 15 years. They've been around for a while. It's not perfect, but it's just the best example of smaller expressions of churches all over the Tampa Bay area, and it's a network of these microchurches. I just think it's beautiful. And I learned about it about 10 years ago. Every time we made a trip down to the Gulf side of Florida, we'd always visit. I started developing a relationship with several of the leaders. And finally, when my wife and I, about 4 years ago, said, hey, if we were going to make one more move, where would it be? We decided that's where it is. And part of it is because I wanted to be in a better position to tell their story back into the tribe that I'm a part of. But also, I just wanted to be an encouragement to them. I just think they're just an amazing group of young people, and they're doing amazing work. But all that to say, when I was still in Kansas City, and I was working with a lot of church planters all around the city, that one Monday morning, I received a phone call from a pastor of an existing church in Kansas City. And this church at one time was probably running about 200 on Sunday mornings, but they had really dwindled down to about 45 or 50 members. And this pastor was pretty discouraged. And he just called me once Monday. It was Monday morning. And he said, hey, Brad, he said, I got a question for you. He said, I know you work with all over the city. And he said, I'm just wondering, when do they meet on Sunday morning? And I just remember thinking, that's kind of a weird question. I said, well, I'll answer that and kind of tell you what a lot of them are doing, but I'm just curious, what prompted that question? And he said, well, last night, because it was Sunday night, he said, we had a business meeting. And we decided we voted that we wanted to reach young families. And the first thought in my mind was, you voted to reach young families? Wait a minute, you have to vote? What's that about? But I said, and he said, and we as a group decided that if we moved our Sunday morning gathering time from 10:30 to 11, it might give younger families that have children that they might come to our church on Sunday morning that didn't otherwise. And I remember and thinking, am I being punked here? Like what? And I was very gracious, and I just said, hey, you know what? If you move your time back, you might have some young families that are already a part of the church that might like an extra 30 minutes. I don't know. But I said, listen, there's no one out in the community that's like waiting for you to push your time back 30 minutes. I mean, sorry, that there's no one. But that story for me illustrates that if we don't fully grasp with how radically different our contexts are, we'll think if we just get a new sign or a new worship leader or a new church name, that everything's going to be okay. And it's not. So part of being an adaptive leader is we've got to understand how radically different things are and then discern how's the best way to articulate that to the people in our church. So first thing I said, as an adaptive leader, we need to correctly assess reality. Secondly, I'm convinced, is we have to cultivate a missionary culture in the church. I love this little quote here from Peter Drucker. He's kind of a famous business guy. He says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, what he means by that is it doesn't matter how grandiose and perfect and amazing your strategy is, if the culture within your organization or your church doesn't the culture will win every single day. I've heard somebody say culture will eat strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it's like we've got to create culture. In fact, I'd say put strategy off for a while and just focus on how can you cultivate a missionary culture. So how do we create a missionary culture? There's more than this, but the four things I like to focus on are these four words: scorecard, stories, celebrations, and language. So this, we're going to do a whole little session tomorrow on this, but we have to start counting and measuring different things. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but right now, for most churches, all we do is count. And what we count is how many people show up and how much money they give. Let me ask you, does how many people show up to your church on Sunday morning have any indication on the influence your church is having on the community? None. Again, it's not evil counting how many people show up. It's not. But we've got to do better. So I think there's a whole different way we can think about scorecards. And when we count and measure, and when we count and measure different things, it creates a culture. People start realizing, wait, if that's what we're going to count, then that must be important. And I'm going to lean towards that. If we just count how many people show up and we let people know that all the time, then they think all their job is to bring people to that gathering, right? Well, if that's how we're measuring success, is how many people show up, then I need to make sure I try to bring as many people as possible. Again, that's not a bad thing. We just got to do better. So scorecards are huge. Stories, just ask yourself, what are the stories you tell within your church gatherings? And I would even do like, I encourage a language and story audit. Like do an audit of what stories are you telling. And if you're not telling any stories, then go out and capture stories of people that are engaged in God's mission, and then tell those stories over and over and over again. Randy, should I just grab the mic? Okay, sorry. Let's do this one. Okay, there, is that better? Sorry about that. So with stories, and I like to say to leaders all the time, look, all the stories don't have to be your stories, but some of the stories need to be your stories. Like the stories of you engaging your neighborhood, or you engaging in the workplace, or you engaging people relationally in social spaces. But then what I would do is go out there and capture the stories of people that are doing a really good job of ministering to their neighbors and meeting people at work or whatever it might be. Capture their stories and tell their stories over and over and over again to crack open the imagination of other people. Because stories, I just think we underestimate the power of the narrative. And stories do a couple of things. One thing is stories show people what bullet points don't, right? It's like, man, you've been talking about that thing for 6 months, but when you told that story, man, a light went off and I got it. I saw what you were talking about. But then the other thing that it does is when you tell a story of what someone else does, we know this isn't rocket science, right? A lot of times people will go like, I could do that. I mean, is that what you're talking about? That story you told? Yeah, that's not difficult. I could do that. So I think stories create culture. So we need to be asking, what are the stories that you tell? And then also related to that is celebrations. Like, what do you celebrate? Are you just celebrating what takes place on Sunday morning? How many people show up? Are you just celebrating your budget? Or are you celebrating all kinds of things outside the walls of the church? Are you celebrating things that are happening in the community? Are you celebrating the jobs that people have? I mean, we're not going to have time to talk a lot about vocation, but I think another paradigm shift that has to happen is we have to think differently about vocation, that we need to blow up this sacred-secular divide, that some vocations are sacred and some vocations are secular. Listen, all work matters, right? I don't care what it is. We need to help people in our congregations understand how their work contributes to and participates in God's redemptive mission. So are we celebrating that? Are we celebrating the work that people are doing in the marketplace Monday through Friday? So celebrations are huge. And then language. Once again, I do a language audit and just start asking yourself, what kind of language are we using language that just makes people think that church is just about the Sunday gathering? Or do we use language to kind of like inspire people outside the walls of the church? Now, I hesitate to like give you examples, but these are some that I've used and these are some that other people use. And man, I'm not into like marketing stuff, but I do think it's not a bad thing to have a little moniker or a little slogan or a phrase that you use that just helps to remind people that church isn't just about the gathering. So here are kind of some silly examples. Like, you've already been sent. Like, that's a phrase I use all the time, because remember in the earlier session we talked about we're a sent missionary people, or we're a sent missionary person. Well, a lot of times the tendency is that people will go, oh, well, I wonder where God's going to send me. And I want to say, no. You've already been sent. You live where you live for a purpose. You work where you work for a purpose. You hang out in the social spaces you hang out for a purpose. You've already been sent there. Don't wait for God to send you somewhere else. Start discovering and discerning where he's already sent you. So that's a simple little phrase. You've already been sent. Every member a missionary. And remember, and I think Rick Warren made it really popular when he said every member a minister. And that's helpful. But what if we said every member is a missionary? And I would even say, I know every time I say that, somebody will push back and say, yeah, missionary, that word missionary's kind of got some baggage. And it does. So don't use it. Use something else. I mean, the main thing I want to do is help people understand they're a sent person, all right? For some reason, if someone's got to hang up with the word missionary, then just help them understand that they're a sent person, that God has sent them where they live, work, and play for a purpose. So we don't need to go down through all these, but everybody gets to play. Like, we need to activate all the people of God. No one sits on the bench. Everybody gets to play. And I mean everybody. Relationships happen in the margins. We don't go to church. We are the church. And, I see on social media all the time, people will say something about going to church. And, when I'm feeling a little snarky, I'll say I'll respond and say, going to church is a theological impossibility. It's like saying, I'm going to go to family. It's like, well, that doesn't even make sense. What do you mean you're going to go to family? That's what it sounds like when we say, I'm going to go to church. Now, we know what we mean. We mean the building. But see, we have to be careful. What are we articulating with the language that we use? The church is a foretaste of the kingdom. The church is an instrument of the kingdom. I love that. And think about it like this. See, when I talked about the Missio Dei, see, God's already at work, and the church is an instrument created by God to be sent into the world to participate in what He's already doing. So the kingdom is bigger than the church. The church is an instrument God created to participate in what He's already doing. That's what I mean by the church is a foretaste of the kingdom, and the church is an instrument of the kingdom. We talked about John chapter 1, verse 14. Maybe this is a little moniker that people start to grab hold of, that the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. That's Scripture. So God's church doesn't have a mission. Rather, God's mission has a church. That sounds like a, kind of silliness there, but it's very profound. God's church doesn't really have a mission. God's mission has a church. Does that make sense? So when we talk about an adaptive leadership, we need to correctly assess reality. I think we need to do everything we possibly can to create a missionary culture. And the third thing is we've got to discover a way or ways, because there's not just one way to do this, but how can we activate more and more people to engage in God's mission? Now, again, this isn't the only way to do it, but years ago when I discovered this, this has just been transformative for me. The way I think about my own giftedness is the way I think about church planting, the way I work with church planters. And it's interesting. You got a copy of 5Q on your table. I'm going to talk about that book here in just a minute because this fits in perfectly with what we're going to talk about here. So if you're not familiar with the language of APES, I think this is one way we've got to think differently about giftedness. So most of the time we think about spiritual gifts to be used inside the body of Christ, which is a good thing. But I think if we're going to really activate all the people of God, especially I find this true for church planters, but I think this is true for existing churches as well. I think you need to be aware of, and most of you probably already are, but maybe more aware of fivefold ministry or APES from Ephesians chapter 4. So I'm just going to touch on this, and if you want to really geek out on it and dig down deep, you got the perfect book sitting on your table. Okay? So I'll mention that here in a minute. So Ephesians, let me read the passage, and then I want to just make some observations about this passage, and I hope this is helpful. So Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11, 12, and 13. The Apostle Paul writes, Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So, hope that slide got sideways here a little bit. That's okay. We can work with it. So if you're not familiar with APES, APES is just an acronym standing for Apostle, Prophet, Evangelist, Shepherd, Teacher. Okay? So now, unfortunately, I think that language of APES, those 5 giftings, have gotten kind of hijacked, you might say, by different groups at different times. And I think sometimes people are a little afraid to even use this language because of the way I think the language has been misused or misapplied in the past. But when you really look at the meaning of each of these gifts, I just want to give you a little different summary of each of these gifts than maybe that you've run across before. And then I want to talk about the application of this as it relates to activating all the people of God. So first off, the word apostle. You know, the word apostle literally means sent one, right? So it's the person that has a pioneering gift. It's someone that extends the gospel. It's someone, sometimes people use the language of cultural architect. The next one, you can't see it for some reason, it went off the slide, but it's prophet. So prophet is the person that sees the difference between what is and what should be. It's the person that challenges the status quo. It's the person that likes to bring correction. They challenge kind of the dominant perspective. They often relate to issues of injustice and restoration. Okay, that's the prophet. The evangelist is the recruiter to the cause. Someone that's a very infectious communicator. They enjoy meeting new people. The shepherd, we all know this, is the one that nurtures, and they're the protector of the community. They're the caregiver. They have a very high sense of loyalty. And then the teacher, most of us are familiar with this, is someone that loves to understand and explain. They find satisfaction when people gain truth and knowledge. They love creating curriculum. They love creating learning pathways, okay? So what does this have to do with what we're talking about here? So 3 things. Number 1 is when I first became a believer, I didn't become a believer until I was almost 30 years old. I was taught that this was a leadership text. You might even say a clergy text. So in other words, I was taught that Ephesians chapter 4, these were gifts given to the leadership or clergy to equip the saints for the work of ministry, right? It's not a leadership text. I mean, it's just not. It's a body text. In other words, those gifts, they're given to the leaders, but they're given to everybody in the body. So we, the saints, are to equip the saints. All right? Does that make sense? So, all right, we'll come back to that. So it's not simply a leadership text. It's a body text. It's for all of us. Secondly, is think of APES as callings or gifts, not roles and offices. And I think, is this being recorded? Okay. Well, no one in my tribe is going to watch probably. But I'm telling you, especially in my tribe, in the Baptist tribe, where we get in so much trouble is we make these offices. Like there's somehow, these are roles or offices. They're not. They're gifts. They're gifts given to the body. Remember earlier that Darrell Guter quote where he says, at the ascension, Jesus empowered the church. Well, he empowered the church with these giftings, Paul says in Ephesians 4. For a purpose, he gifted these gifts to the body so we would all reach maturity. So actually he says so we would experience the fullness of Christ. Well, here's the problem. The third point, Christendom and APES, when I showed you those 3 circles and I said it fundamentally changed our ecclesiology, here's how it fundamentally changed our ecclesiology. When Constantine and Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, we got rid of 3 of the gifts. I mean, the apes, that some people call them, the APEs, apostle, prophets, evangelists, they didn't fit anymore because the church was structured by, organized by, and led by 2 of the gifts, the shepherd teacher. Because again, if everyone's a Christian, and they weren't really, but in Christendom, that's what everyone assumed, you didn't need the apostle, the prophet, and the evangelist. You just needed the shepherd teacher. Well, that's where I say that we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot in the big scheme of things, because still today, the church is informed by, organized around, and led by only 2 of the gifts. Now listen, please hear me. I'm not minimizing the shepherd teacher. I'm just saying we need to elevate the APEs, because Paul once again says, without all 5 of the gifts being in operation, the church will not reach maturity. And I think it's pretty easy to argue the church isn't experiencing maturity. And I'm convinced part of the reason is because we're only being influenced by the shepherd teacher. But again, it's not about minimizing the shepherd teacher. It's about elevating the other 3. We need each other. Regardless of how you're gifted, you can't exercise your gift to its fullness without those other gifts speaking into and operating with you. All right? So, a couple things here. So, I just want to really quickly touch on this and then talk about a couple other adaptive leadership issues, I think. But if you have some questions about APES, maybe some of this will help address that just a little bit. Is typically if someone's not familiar with it, they've even heard language and they weren't real familiar, or they weren't comfortable with someone being called an apostle or a prophet. Well, see, I would never call someone an apostle or a prophet. I would say that person has an apostolic gifting. Like they're a pioneering. They like to start things. In fact, I would say some of the best church planters, they're apostolic. Does that make sense? They're not the shepherd teacher, because if you're a shepherd teacher, church planter, you want to start that Sunday morning thing as quickly as you can so you can teach to them and shepherd the flock. That's not a bad thing, but some of the best church planters are apostolic. They're the pioneers, they're the entrepreneurs. All right, you follow? So I'm just saying, but what happens sometimes is I think we hear some of the language, how it's kind of got sidejacked, and we're kind of scared of it. So then we want to push back, and there's objections to it. So I just want to share with you 5 or 6 objections that I hear sometimes from people that aren't comfortable with the APES language, and maybe this will just help you say, okay, I need to dig into this a little bit more. So the question that's usually asked is this: why should the gifts in Ephesians 4 be given greater prominence than the gifts mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament? Okay, so here's how I like to address it. 5 or 6 really quick things. Number one is biblical commentators have long held Ephesians as something of a constitutional document of the church. Like all constitutions, it's meant to guide all subsequent thinking and actions in the organization. Here's the bottom line. The book represents the best thinking about the church, at least how Paul understood it. So I would just say, there's no other book in the New Testament that ought to inform the way we understand our ecclesiology more than Ephesians. It's like this was Paul's kind of like constitution for the founding of the church. Okay? That's number one. Second, Ephesians 4, 1 through 16 presents a promise that no other passage in Scripture claims. That is maturity and fullness of Christ. In other words, if we desire unity, which is described in 1 through 6, and strive for maturity, which is talked about in verses 11 through 16, it is extremely difficult to discount the significance of the connection point between unity and maturity, and that's the diversity of gifts. That all 5 of these gifts need to be in operation. Okay? All right, here's my favorite one. Because a lot of times people go, well, wait, why are we putting so much emphasis on like these words in just one verse, like just in this one passage or one verse in Ephesians chapter 4? I like to remind people of this. So third, Ephesians 4 is not the only passage where APES is mentioned. Apostle, and remember, this isn't a role or office, it's a gifting. Apostle or sent one is used over 80 times in the New Testament. The word prophet is used nearly 800 times in Scripture, 150 times in the New Testament. Evangelist is also used in Acts and 2 Timothy. Shepherd is used 23 times in the New Testament. And teacher is used 129 in the New Testament. Now I'm going to make some of you mad at me. Compare that to the language of pastor. And again, I'm not deconstructing here. I'm just making a point. Okay? We love to use the word pastor as kind of a catch-all word for like every church leadership, right? Do you know how many times the word pastor is used in the New Testament as a noun? Once. And it's in this passage, Ephesians chapter 4. And most New Testament scholars say the better word is shepherd, not pastor. So do you see what I'm getting at? If your objection is, yeah, I don't like the language of apostle or prophet, it's like, these are biblical words, and they have really rich, deep, helpful language. We just need to rescue or recapture it. Don't let somebody else, define it in a way that's not biblical. So, okay, see, now you're mad at me, aren't you? All right, so real quick. Fourth, if you have an issue with thinking about these gifts as personal callings or gifts, then at least consider them as functions of the church. So here's my point. Sometimes people will say, yeah, I'm still not really comfortable with those 5 words like being gifts given to the body. I'll say, fine, that's okay. At least think about them as functions of the church. Like think of those gifts that Jesus at the ascension gave the church. Think about them as functions. And if you're thinking about them as functions, I think it's hard to deny. I like to ask questions like this. Ask, is the church to be apostolic? Like, is the church to be starting things? Is the church to be pioneering? Is the church to be out front? I'd say yes. Is the church to be prophetic? Yes, right? We should be calling out injustice. We should be the one saying, that's not right. Like, there's a gap between what is and what should be. And the church ought to step in that gap. Should the church be evangelistic? Well, that's a no-brainer, right? Should the church be a shepherding and teaching community? Yes. I mean, we should be the quintessential shepherding community, right? So, of course, the answer to all these questions ought to be a resounding yes. So if you don't like, you struggle a little bit for whatever reason with these being gifts given to the body, then think about them as functions. And then fifth, because sometimes people say, well, yeah, but what about the spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians or in Romans? I like to say the gifts of 1 Corinthians are manifestations or gifts of the Spirit, and the gifts in Romans are more skill-based, while Ephesians 4 are callings or vocations that are actually given to the body of Jesus, by Jesus. The gifts in Ephesians 4 are actually the people or the body of Christ. And they're simply gifts. It's the person is the gift. And then the last thing is 6, consider the representation. Here's where the 5Q book comes in. Consider the representation or existence of the APES gifts to be broader than just Ephesians 4. Now this might blow your mind a little, but Alan Hirsch in this book in 5Q makes, I think, a very strong case that we can actually see APES in the created order. So the fivefold pattern can be discerned in and throughout all of God's creation, not just the church. In other words, APES is laced by God throughout his creation. Now, we don't have time to go through this, but in other words, Alan just does a masterful job in that book saying, no, actually APES, these 5 giftings, you can actually see it in all of creation. And it's certainly not just in the church, right? When you think of these gifts like out in the marketplace, are there teachers? Heck yeah. Are there shepherds? Heck yeah. Are there people that are apostolic? Are there people that are prophetic? They're not just gifts given to the church, but he would argue they're actually laced throughout the created order. And then the very last point with this is that last line. If nothing else convinces you, I hope this does, is further, and this is incredibly significant, is APES is fully incorporated into the life of Jesus. In other words, Jesus is the archetype of every one of these gifts. Jesus was rabbi teacher. He was the great shepherd. Jesus was the sent one, right? He was the prophet. Jesus was the Word made flesh, evangelistic. So I just want you to see Jesus is the perfect archetype, and at the ascension, he gave these gifts to the church, the body of Christ, to continue the work of Jesus in the world. And I'm just convinced part of that we can do better if we think about the APES gifts given to the body and help people understand their gifting. So here's the last thing I'll say on APES, and this is the way I like to use it for church planters, but I hope this will be a simple application that you might be able to use as well, is I'll just say, once we have time to really unpack APES, that there's 4 things I would really encourage you to do. Number 1 is identify your own gifting. So if you don't already know, this doesn't have to be an assessment. I think if you really kind of read about the gifts, you'll kind of go, oh yeah, I know, I'm very much apostolic, or I'm very evangelistic. But there's a couple of really good APES assessments out there that are free that you can take, that kind of help you hone in. But I tell church planters all the time, first thing you need to do is you need to identify how you're wired and how you're gifted. Because if you're a shepherd teacher, you're going to have tendencies towards that Sunday morning thing. But if your tendencies are apostolic, you're just going to go, and you're not going to worry about caring for the flock, things like that. So the first thing is identify your gifting. Second is discover what gifts are missing on your team. And that's what I meant just now. I know somebody. He's a fantastic church planter. He's a super high A, super high apostolic. And there's been a couple times in the life of his church, they've almost had to, the rest of his team have almost had to have an intervention with him to say, dude, you're killing us. Because he was just always pushing, because he was very high apostolic and very high prophetic. He didn't have a shepherding bone in his body. But thank goodness he had shepherds on his team that could come alongside him and say to him, no, listen, we've got to take care of the flock. Yeah, let's keep pushing, but we've got to do this too. So first thing, you got to identify how you're wired. Secondly, discover what gifts are missing on your team. Third is decide how are you going to best listen to each other. Remember, we have to have each other. We won't reach maturity or experience the fullness of Christ unless all 5 of these gifts are being exercised. So we need to figure out as a team, if you're gifted in one way, how are you going to make sure that those with different giftings have your ear and vice versa? And then last, how will you ensure the equipping of the saints? So the thing that I think is another thing that's fascinating about this passage is it's really an equipping passage. Because remember, again, I was taught it's a leadership. We have these gifts to equip the saints for the work of ministry. But if it's a body text, then all of us need to be equipping each other. So what I mean by that last question is, how will you make sure that those who are evangelistic are equipping others to be evangelistic? How are you going to make sure that those that have the gift of teaching are teaching other people how to be good teachers? How are you, those that have a shepherding gift, how are you going to make sure they're equipping others to help care for the flock? So I think that's one way we can go about activating all the people of God to engage in God's mission. So I said we need to think adaptive leadership, not operational. And to think more adaptively, we need to correctly assess reality. We need to cultivate a missionary culture. And then we need to step into how can we activate more and more people to engage in God's mission. And then last 2 thoughts on leadership. The first one is I just call it change theory. So I want to show you an image. This isn't in the Rethink book, but I've just found working with existing congregations, this was one of the most helpful images and exercises that I ever do. but it's about how to bring about change in existing church. One thing that I would suggest is please don't go back and like blow things up. Don't go back and say, okay, man, we're doing it all wrong, because you're not doing it all wrong. That's the encouragement part, right? We're doing a lot of things right and good and beautiful, but we just have to challenge ourselves to say, are there a few things we need to unlearn and relearn? But even in that, I like to say we need to think about incremental shifts. If you're patient enough, think about incremental shifts. Like right now, if let's say 10% of your congregation is really engaged in God's mission outside the walls of the church, what would it look like if you got that to 20% or 30% or 40? Or what about 50? What if 50% of your congregation was fully engaged in God's mission outside the walls of the church? Those are incremental shifts. So here's a little image. It's called, and some of you have probably seen this and you're aware of it, but man, I've just found this to be super, super helpful in light of the conversation we're having here about leadership. So this little image is called the diffusion of innovation. So at some point, don't do this now, but if you were to Google diffusion innovation, you're going to see this has been proven hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times with all kinds of organizations. It doesn't matter what kind of organization, nonprofit or business world, churches, doesn't matter if it's a church of 20 people or 200 people or 2,000 people, this rings true every single time. So here's what this is about. It says that regardless of the size of organization, the people in that organization can be divided up in these different groups, all right? So 2.5% are called innovators, 13.5% are called early adopters, 34% are early majority, 34% are late majority, and then 16% are called laggards. Now, I would recommend don't call them laggards, okay? Just come up with a different word, okay? But here's what's so helpful, is the reason it's called the diffusion of innovation is it says that when there's an innovation or a new idea, and if it's introduced into an organization, you introduce it over here, and the idea diffuses itself over the organization, depending on where people are. So in other words, innovators are somebody that's already doing it. It's like in light of this conversation we're having about mission, like right now, if you thought about your church, there's at least 2.5% of the people in your church, they are fully engaged in all of this, right? And in fact, you don't need it. They're telling you stuff, right? You're not telling them what they need to do. They've been doing this, they've been doing it for a long time. They're an innovator. They're like out in front of everybody already. An early adopter is somebody that when you have this conversation, they go like, I thought I was crazy. I've been thinking like this for like 10 years and I didn't know who to talk to. I mean, you don't need to really convince them. They grab hold of it pretty quickly. Early adopter, all right? Early majority, they're sitting back and watching for a while. It's like, yeah, I kind of like what you're saying there and I think I'm in, but I'm going to stay on the sidelines for a little bit. I'm going to kind of see how this, comes out here. And then late majority, it just takes them a long time. And laggards, for whatever reason, they're probably never, ever, ever going to get on board. There's just something in the way they think, or there's a past experience, or for whatever reason, they're just never going to be able to. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so with the laggards, that just for whatever reason, there's something there that just is keeping them from seeing or getting what we're talking about. But I remember the very first time I learned this, that was so helpful for me just to know. And we just got to love them, right? I mean, as it relates to the church context, just make sure they're not like on your board, right? Or making decisions, right? Or you're just going to be banging your head against the wall. So here's a couple things about this that I think are really helpful. Number one, and this is what's been proven over and over again, is that there's a tipping point at 16%. And you'll notice 16% is when you take early adopters and add it to innovators. So the point is, when 16% of the people in your organization have grabbed hold of and embraced that new idea, there's a tipping point and there's no going back. So why I think this is really helpful is you don't have to change everybody's mindset, all right? Just go back and focus on the innovators and early adopters. And like I said earlier about stories, Capture their stories and tell them over and over and over again to the rest of the organization, and eventually there's going to be a tipping point. The other thing that's helpful about this for me is that if you are an innovator or early adopter, it's probably best if you don't try to convince a late majority. It's probably, if you're an innovator, I would suggest you be working with the early adopters, and then let the early adopters try to influence the early majority, and then let the early majority influence the late majority. Or otherwise, if you're an innovator, you know, and you're going to a late majority, they're just going to go, oh, great, here comes Dan again with another crazy idea, you know. But if you're talking to the early adopter, they're going to go, heck yeah, man, I'm on board with you. Let's try that. So just thinking about your organization. And again, I hope this is a word of encouragement of thinking about incremental shifts. If you have the patience, if you don't, just go out and start something new, okay? But if you have the patience, think about incremental shift and focus on the innovators and early adopters and let that begin to diffuse the idea throughout the organization. And then the very last thing, and I've already said this, is just be patient. Again, think incremental shifts. Think long haul rather than quick fix. You know, I really do think part of what ails the church in North America, it's the result of, I said earlier, of 40 years, almost 50 years of church growth mentality. And you could even say it's 1,700 years of Christendom thinking. Well, if that's the case, you can't preach a 6-week sermon and think everyone's going to get it, right? So you have to think long haul. You have to think incremental shifts. You have to dig into this yourself, tell your own stories, model it for other people, and then tap into the innovators and early adopters and let them help you shift the culture. So I like this little line: the greatest challenge facing the church in the West is the reconversion of its own members. And it's not going to happen overnight. So, all right, Crystal's going to come up and just lead a debrief time like we did with the earlier session.